The final frame caught by the security feed showed two gloved hands moving with clear intent, lunging right toward the glass before the screen went entirely black. That transmission abruptly died at precisely 1:47 a.m. What follows is the baffling case of 84-year-old Nancy Guthrie, who seemingly evaporated from her Tucson residence in a mere 41 minutes. Yet, this documentary dives much deeper than a simple missing persons case. We are looking at the massive blockade erected around the probe from day one, exploring exactly who put those barriers in place, their true motives, and the ultimate price paid for that secrecy. Expect a deep dive into each crime scene call, every stonewalled tip, and the official on-the-record statements that lay bare the actual chaos unfolding within the Pima County Sheriff's Department during the search for Nancy. Keep watching, because absolutely everything regarding this mystery shatters initial assumptions. For first-time viewers, hit that subscribe button right now. We steer clear of baseless rumors around here. Instead, we dig up the hard facts. Let us set the scene the evening of Saturday, January 31st, 2026, in Tucson, Arizona. Born on January 27th, 1942. Nancy enjoyed a routine weekend night visiting her daughter for supper and a few rounds of cards before packing it in at 9:48 p.m. Following the gathering, her son-in-law dropped her off at her property, waiting until the garage completely shut with her safely inside. No friend or family member ever laid eyes on her again after that moment. Everything that happened next had to be pieced together using a trio of electronic clues. Starting right at 1:47 a.m., that is when the front porch lens stopped broadcasting. This was no technical glitch. Human hands deliberately severed the connection before 2:12 a.m. rolled around, triggering an inside alarm that caught movement but saved zero video, leaving behind nothing but a chilling digital fingerprint of an unknown presence creeping through the halls until 2:28 a.m., which is the precise second Nancy's heart implant dropped its Bluetooth link to her cellular device. Documenting the exact instant communication vanished. A blinded lens, a tripped sensor, a dead medical monitor, 41 minutes total. Detectives were handed that incredibly tight time frame to solve the puzzle. So try to imagine the crime scene technicians the following day. You have got computer screens illuminating a dark office space accompanied by the relentless clacking of keys. An investigator furiously scribbles digital markers onto yellow paper as a cyber expert manages to extract shattered files from an online database that was supposed to be completely wiped clean. The tension hanging in the air felt suffocatingly real because the elderly woman absolutely relied on her cardiac device to survive. According to what the head of the department stated later, missing her daily prescriptions could turn fatal in under 24 hours. Meaning the ticking countdown was not merely dramatic flair, it was a literal matter of life and death. Put yourself in their shoes for a second, staring down those three distinct data points with federal agents on standby right down the hall. Who do you immediately dial? Well, whoever got that initial ring triggered a domino effect so bizarre that the former undersheriff later slammed it as a petty 11-year vendetta disguised as standard protocol. To wrap your head around the strange direction this manhunt took, you first have to figure out the guy calling the shots. Those monumental choices that shaped the entire probe definitely did not materialize out of thin air. They stemmed from deep-seated baggage, a highly papered 11-year feud between Sheriff Chris Nanos and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Once you dig into that past rivalry, the massive missteps we break down in these episodes suddenly transform from simple incompetence into a chillingly deliberate strategy. Chris Nanos devoted decades of his life to working his way up the ladder at the Pima County Sheriff's Department before finally grabbing the highest rank. Being a total lifer meant he possessed an intimate grasp of the agency's hierarchy, unspoken rules, and toxic office politics, giving him a perfect map of exactly who had his back and who wanted him gone. He recognized every single vulnerability within the force and viewed the feds not as partners in fighting crime, but as the very outfit that once trained its crosshairs squarely on his administration. Back in 2015, federal agents launched an official probe targeting Pima County deputies over accusations they were mismanaging money seized through civil asset forfeiture. For context, We are talking about cash and property confiscated from suspects during active police busts. Law enforcement agencies have to track every dime of that haul under incredibly tight national rules. But this audit was completely unhidden, instantly sparking a massive media firestorm. Essentially, it dragged the entire precinct under the federal spotlight, right when the top brass desperately relied on voter trust to stay in power. That exact scandal played a massive role in getting Nanos booted from office during the 2016 election, which is something you really need to let sink in. Imagine spending a lifetime serving in the exact same precinct, only to be publicly ousted by voters while government agents breathe down your department's neck. That kind of humiliation is deeply personal. You are talking about a guy being forced to watch his entire legacy crumble to the ground, knowing full well the feds were the ones swinging the sledgehammer. Years later, he managed to reclaim his title, stepping right back into his old command post where the halls and uniforms remained completely unchanged. Yet, enduring that brutal takedown forever warped the way he interacted with the federal authorities responsible for his temporary downfall. Nobody understood this deep-seated bitterness quite like Richard Kastigar Jr. Having spent years acting as the sheriff's primary right-hand man, he held the number 2 spot until finally hanging up his hat in 2023, following an impressive 46-year career. When the current scandal hit the news, he refused to hide behind unnamed quotes. Instead, he boldly went on the record with the Daily Mail, publicly confirming the dirty secret everyone at the station already knew. He openly stated that his former boss heavily despises the Bureau, harboring serious resentment over the 2016 probe, and pointed out that such a harsh critique was not just campaign trail mudslinging. It also was not just some reporter connecting imaginary dots to invent a spicy headline. Those damning words came straight from the guy who shared an executive wall with him for over a decade, witnessing firsthand how the sheriff navigated immense stress, cutthroat elections, and the grueling daily grind of managing a massive police force. Kastigar even took it a step further, labeling the head honcho a textbook control freak who completely lacked the skills to get the job done right. A pair of distinct descriptions originating from a single person, backed by 46 years of direct, on-the-ground experience. Put yourself in this position. The biggest investigation of your life lands in your lap, but cracking it means handing crucial proof over to the very agency you blame for ruining your professional trajectory. Is it really possible to make an unbiased choice in that moment? Just how much of your past baggage influences you when you finally have to decide? Well, in February 2026, that precise situation played out in real life. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was right there waiting. Physical clues were available, and a definitive choice was finalized. We are about to dive into the specifics of that ruling, the price it carried, and what it exposed regarding the handling of those clues. 2 miles away from Nancy Guthrie's residence, out in an empty lot bordering the highway, a detective kneeled to photograph a new discovery. It was one dark, snug-fitting hand covering that looked identical to the one seen on Nancy's front porch security footage exactly 14 days prior. Hidden within its fabric was physical trace evidence, an unidentified genetic profile belonging to an anonymous man. Authorities collected this item on February 15, 2026, which marked 2 full weeks since the probe began. As soon as the item was officially bagged and tagged, the next step seemed completely obvious and straightforward: analyze the genetic material. You check it through the federal registry, wait for a hit, and then use that data to either name your perpetrator or rule out a lead to pursue another angle. No matter the outcome, you make progress. That is exactly the way crime scene biology is meant to operate, and it is the sole reason investigators bother gathering it at all. The Federal Bureau of Investigation possessed an established, reliable system tailor-made for this exact situation, sending materials straight to their facility in Quantico, Virginia. At that national laboratory, specialists compare the swab against CODIS, a government registry holding the genetic blueprints of more than 19 million people with previous arrest records. Imagine the setup: a brightly lit screen in a Virginia forensics department where an analyst compares known offender data with the mysterious trace evidence. A successful match had the potential to instantly pivot 400 law enforcement officers into one unified, Strategic strike. This sophisticated network was not just a pipe dream. It was fully functional and waiting for authorization to act. Even if the federal system came up empty, another viable option was waiting Othram, a Texas-based DNA and family lineage facility famous for cracking the University of Idaho student slayings. During that particular probe, specialists at that lab received a genetic swab taken from a weapon cover, and within 48 hours, they successfully mapped out the killer's lineage and constructed a genealogical chart. They eventually funneled the possibilities down to a pair of relatives in Pennsylvania, leading to a capture just 47 days after the homicides. A tested, verified, and replicable process. Federal agents requested that Sheriff Nanos forward the recovered hand covering to Virginia, but he flat out refused. The news agency Reuters verified this refusal on February 12th, citing an inside source from a national policing agency. Instead, Nanos shipped the item to DNA Labs International, an independent testing facility located in Deerfield Beach, Florida, roughly 2,000 miles away from Tucson. Local officials ultimately burned through roughly $200,000 of citizens' tax money sending the materials to a commercial business, rather than handing it over to the national agency that was already on site and offering assistance. According to News Nation, the behind-the-scenes response from federal agents was crystal clear. They blasted the move as utterly foolish and completely crazy. Insiders pointed out that the withheld item basically represented the entire physical basis of the ongoing investigation. Ultimately, the commercial scientists tested the genetic material against the federal registry, but they got 0 hits, meaning the anonymous guy was not among the 19 million offenders currently filed in the system. Shortly after, the analysis of the biological traces found inside the house finally came back. Relying on insiders familiar with the probe, CBS News stated that the genetic traces collected indoors at Nancy's residence proved to be weak, incomplete, and heavily contaminated by the DNA of people who actually lived in or frequently visited the house. It was virtually worthless for establishing a definitive match. But then a massive revelation completely flipped the narrative. The genetic blueprint from the outside lot and the traces from inside the house were completely different, meaning authorities were now looking at 2 distinct, unidentified suspects. Neither sample triggered a federal database alert, leaving a $200,000 commercial testing choice acting as a roadblock. This prevented the use of advanced family tree tracing, a method that CeCe Moore, the expert who aided in the Kohberger arrest, claimed might have generated leads in a matter of hours. 25 days into the manhunt, the route selected by the head of the department had yielded absolutely no named targets. You really have to wonder when the perfect resource is literally standing right beside you, begging to assist. What is the ultimate price of turning them away? In this specific situation, they are still tallying up the collateral damage. 400 officers were actively working the streets. Federal operatives were deployed locally, and veteran murder investigators boasting decades of joint expertise were stationed at headquarters. The funding, the specialized knowledge, and the sheer human capital were all readily available. Yet every solitary operational call was bottlenecked by just 3 guys. Only 3 individuals. Informants working within the Pima County Sheriff's Office confided in the Daily Mail under the promise of strict secrecy while the probe unfolded. The picture they painted wasn't of a leadership team optimized for fast results, but rather a heavily guarded silo designed to maintain absolute dominance. The department had restricted every single major call regarding the Nancy Guthrie tragedy to a tight circle consisting solely of himself, Chief Jesus Lopez, and Captain Juan Carlos Navarro. This trio micromanaged all fieldwork, dictated every tactical pivot, and heavily monitored any data traveling through the ranks. As one insider bluntly stated, the boss absolutely refused to let anyone outside of himself or his 2 favorite deputies make a move regarding the probe. Every other officer is simply following orders, completely stripped of their ability to offer input or voice an alternative perspective. A separate insider broke down exactly how that setup impacted the whole operation. Under typical circumstances, a seasoned investigator would run point on an operation of this magnitude, feeding progress reports up the ladder. Yet, what went down here was the complete reverse. Management had completely taken the wheel, The actual crime-solving professionals were shoved into the back and instructed to keep their mouths shut. It is a classic case of the tail wagging the dog. That idiom hits incredibly hard once you see it playing out in real life. Imagine a bullpen packed with seasoned detectives who have dedicated their entire lives to solving abduction cases. We are talking about folks who know the evidence trails inside and out, who can read psychological red flags, and fully grasp the ticking clock hanging over an incident where an older captive desperately needs their medication. All of those experts were right there in the building, ready to deploy their skills. Yet upper management absolutely refused to tap into any of it. The FBI kept running into that exact same roadblock from an external position. A federal contact shared with the American Tribune that their team eventually hit a phase where they could not figure out the reason behind the constant pushback. The guy is completely shutting them out, and nobody has a clue as to why. We are not just talking about some minor red tape annoyance here. This involves a massive national department that was asked to help, brought their absolute best resources to the table, only to be left stumbling around in the dark on purpose. Ex-federal agent Maureen O'Connell said it flat out on News Nation, stating that whenever problems arise, they typically stem from the highest ranks. The issues rarely start with the everyday officers putting in the sweat, and based on all reports, those frontline teams were definitely grinding hard. Patrol units hit the streets, investigators chased down clues, and researchers combed through information pouring in from a hotline that took over 19,000 calls. The gears of the entire inquiry were turning exactly as they should, but the folks steering the ship restricted all choices to just 3 specific guys, whose main credential seemingly boiled down to being tight with the boss. Bob Krier, the former tactical team leader for Pima County, mentioned on News Nation that things were getting dangerously close to snapping. Sooner or later, someone was going to have to take that leap and deal with it. The sheer firepower the FBI brings to the table absolutely dwarfs anything local law enforcement can muster. Yet, by day 25, nobody had made that move. It really makes you wonder how a manhunt operates when the most qualified minds in the room get pushed away by the folks supposedly leading the charge. Whenever top-tier skill is available but power is restricted, and just 3 guys hold all the cards while keeping 400 officers in the dark, you are nowhere near peak efficiency. What you actually have is a massive operation, constrained entirely by its tightest choke point. Furthermore, that specific choke point had a messy past with the federal agents, a detail nobody in that circle felt like addressing out loud just yet. Any abduction case out there relies heavily on a single core rule before anything else: controlling the narrative. You only share details that allow civilians to assist the team, while keeping the rest totally under wraps. No matter what happens, you absolutely never broadcast your hand to the perpetrator, revealing your blind spots or estimating when you might finally catch them. Keeping things tight like that is not just playing it safe with protocol. It is quite literally a matter of life and death. The second a criminal figures out the limits of the police's knowledge, they can easily exploit those blind spots forever. Yet, Sheriff Nanos hopped onto a countrywide broadcast and completely tore that foundational rule to shreds. On February 23rd, marking day 23 of the search, he did an interview with NBC and casually admitted on tape that their genetic testing had hit a wall, noting that answers could take weeks, months, or potentially an entire year. Yes, weeks, months, or maybe a year. Just imagine the person who snatched Nancy Guthrie sitting there viewing that exact segment. They are chilling in their living room, staring at the screen, watching the Pima County Sheriff chat with a major news host, laying out crystal clear just how long the cops would be stuck before naming a suspect. The criminal did not process that as a simple media briefing. For them, it was a massive grace period, pure validation that the ticking clock the police faced was nowhere near as urgent as people thought. And that was hardly the only leak. Way earlier in the hunt, the boss openly admitted they were using a federal Bluetooth tracker attached to a chopper, specifically aiming to pinpoint Nancy's heart monitor. This specific gear was built to fly completely under the radar. For the rig to work properly, the chopper had to cruise super low to the ground and stay right on top of the target frequency. The scanning radius was incredibly tight, meaning its success hinged 100% on the bad guy being clueless about its presence. The instant he blabbed about it to the press, the tool became entirely useless. President Trump even called this out straight from Air Force One on February 19th. He mentioned he strongly disliked how they telegraphed the whole heart monitor tracking plan before it even kicked off. He pointed out that if she could be located via her implant, the kidnapper would just take steps to block the signal. That is not some partisan talking point. That is simply common sense tactical thinking, laid out clearly by a guy observing the exact same news updates as the rest of the country. Those aerial sweeps never managed to lock onto a solid ping. By day 2 of the search, the department head announced to the media that skipping Nancy's meds would become fatal within 24 hours, completely accurate from a medical standpoint. Yet, it also served as a perfectly wrapped piece of intel for whoever had her. It locked in the time frame, telling them exactly when the stakes of keeping her breathing would shift entirely. Look, back on February 22nd, Nanos actually went on NBC and admitted that detectives were getting closer to tracking down the perpetrator's footwear, along with their slacks, top, and coat, adding that investigators had been passing around pictures of a gun holster to regional firearm dealers. In a different broadcast, NBC revealed how federal agents dropped by a minimum of one firearm store carrying a catalog of about 24 pictures. Each single leak basically handed the perpetrator a roadmap of what evidence the cops possessed and the exact methods they were deploying to track him down. Contrast that with the Idaho case, where federal authorities released exactly a single official comment prior to taking Brian Kohberger into custody. They just said they were looking for a male with a standard physique, roughly 5'9" to 5'10". They shared zero details regarding forensic schedules, investigative techniques, apparel clues, or their overall strategy. Fast forward 47 days, and they had their guy in handcuffs. Put yourself in the shoes of a detective sitting there, witnessing all these sensitive details being broadcast live. What exactly would cross your mind? How would that make you feel? Ultimately, the massive divide between the information that got leaked and the secrets that needed to remain under wraps is probably the biggest failure of this whole operation. If you want to comprehend the absolute mess that the Guthrie inquiry turned into, you have to examine a scenario where every single piece fell perfectly into place, where competent professionals took all the correct steps in the absolute perfect sequence, where clues were properly routed, leading to a swift resolution that Tucson officials really should have used as their gold standard. Take Moscow, Idaho. On November 13th, 2022, authorities discovered 4 college kids brutally murdered in an off-campus house. And that location gave detectives exactly one crucial physical clue. The killer dropped a blade cover. It was just one solitary item holding a lone genetic swab from an unidentified guy. Detectives quickly shipped that genetic material over to the team at Othram, less than 48 hours after it arrived. The lab's advanced genealogical tracking techniques had successfully mapped out the perpetrator's family history, built out a complete lineage chart, and focused the manhunt down to just a couple of households located in Pennsylvania. Federal agents grabbed that genetic roadmap and used it to positively identify their prime target. Cops tracked the guy down, watched his every move, grabbed a backup genetic swab from his trash, verified the connection, and ultimately took him down. They apprehended Brian Kohberger exactly 47 days following the homicides. That is 47 days involving a single genetic swab, a lone testing facility, and an incredibly smooth process running straight from the victim's house to the suspect's capture. At no point did the feds call a media briefing to brag about their advanced investigative tools. They certainly never went on nationwide broadcasts to share their forensic schedules. Nor did they leak any info regarding the apparel they were tracking or the specific retail locations they happened to be checking out. Authorities gave the public a single update regarding the perpetrator's physical appearance and kept their mouths completely shut until they locked him up. Now, compare that flawless strategy to what happened down in Tucson. That glove they found roughly 2 miles away from Nye's property back on February 15th had genetic material belonging to an unidentified guy. Federal authorities begged to take it to Quantico, yet local cops shipped it down to Florida anyway. Unfortunately, that Florida facility failed to find any hits in the national database. Furthermore, The biological traces pulled from inside the residence were degraded, incomplete, and contaminated with other profiles. Those two swabs were a complete mismatch, leading the local sheriff to jump on nationwide broadcasts on day 23 to claim the forensic backlog might take weeks, months, or potentially an entire year to sort out. Yet the exact same advanced genealogical science that cracked the Idaho homicides in just 47 days was sitting right there for Tucson detectives to use from the very beginning. CeCe Moore, the incredibly talented genetic investigator responsible for pinpointing Kohberger, mentioned to CNN that she felt incredibly optimistic regarding the Guthrie situation. She explained how, assuming the perpetrator had long-standing American roots, the advanced DNA tracking methods driving their research might actually spit out a name in a matter of minutes or just a few hours. And she absolutely was not exaggerating what this science could accomplish. She basically just highlighted the exact same proven results we all witnessed up in Idaho. Meanwhile, David Mittelman, the head of Othram, chatted with the Daily Mail regarding the Guthrie manhunt. He stressed that securing immediate results was the top priority and gave a very clear warning about letting the forensic process bog down at any point. Unfortunately, he issued that caution way after the process had already hit a massive wall. Ex-federal agent Jennifer Coffindaffer took things a step further by openly questioning if that independent Florida facility had already ruined the crucial biological traces required for genealogical testing to actually work. She essentially wondered if the exact swab capable of matching the 47-day turnaround seen in the Kohberger manhunt got completely trashed by poor handling, destroying any chance of a quick match. Nobody has given the public a straight answer on that issue yet. However, what we can clearly see right now is the stark contrast between the two operations. You have one investigation boasting flawless evidence handling, the absolute best testing facility, and seamless cooperation with the feds that resulted in a capture in just 47 days. Then you have the alternative scenario, hampered by ruined forensics and a local sheriff actively shutting out federal agents, hitting day 25 without a single viable suspect. The massive gap between those two results had absolutely nothing to do with chance. It all boiled down to choices. Plus, there is a very specific kind of gravity attached to words spoken by individuals who gain absolutely zero personal benefit from sharing them. People completely free from partisan motives or external competitions. They didn't have the luxury of sitting on the sidelines. These were insiders, armed with decades of direct experience who finally decided everyday citizens had a right to know the hard truth. And that's exactly how it played out once the inner circle around Sheriff Nanos broke their silence. Richard Kastigar Jr. wasn't some low-level beat cop just repeating office gossip. He actually held the title of Chief Deputy. He was the right-hand man who worked shoulder to shoulder with Chris Nanos for years, wrapping up a massive 46-year career at that very agency when he stepped down in 2023. He didn't mince words at all during his interview with the Daily Mail. He completely dropped the filters, stating exactly what he felt history needed to show local cops should have handed this whole mess over to the FBI a full 2 weeks prior. From day one, every single piece of evidence needed to be shipped straight to Quantico. He then delivered the exact quote that completely shaped how everyday people have viewed this probe ever since. The sheriff absolutely despises federal agents because they looked into his office back in 2016, and he's been carrying a massive chip on his shoulder ever since. Following that, he shared a detail that completely changes how you look at every single tactical move we've covered in this show. He described the boss as the ultimate ineffective micromanager. That's just a couple of quick sentences, but they carry the heavy weight of 46 years of first-hand observation. Yet Kastigar wasn't alone in speaking out, which is huge, considering it's incredibly easy to write off one lone critic as just having a personal beef, no matter their credentials. What you simply can't ignore, though, is a consistent chorus of insiders, spanning all sorts of positions and ranks within that exact same agency. Every single one of them reached the exact same verdict, completely on their own. Sergeant Aaron Cross heads up the Pima County Deputies Organization. That's the labor union, standing up for the sheriff's personal crew, the officers under his watch, and the staff grinding it out in the trenches daily. Cross certainly didn't sugarcoat anything about what he'd witnessed. He flat out told the press that it's widely believed around the precinct that Sheriff Nanos turned this entire tragedy into a massive ego trip, meaning this isn't just some armchair quarterbacking. It's actually a widely shared internal view, voiced straight by the guy elected to speak for the department's own rank and file. Former Chief Deputy Richard Carmona hit the television circuit, absolutely praising the everyday officers grinding away at the investigation without holding anything back. He highlighted the investigators, the street patrol, the data crunchers, basically everybody who kept their eyes strictly on the prize. Then he zeroed in on the big boss, delivering a calculated critique that you'd only hear from a guy who used to sit in that chair and knows how things should actually be run. He openly admitted his deep frustration over the complete void of guidance coming from upper management. Having a past second-in-command go on a national broadcast to blast the current sheriff for poor leadership is incredibly jarring. Maureen O'Connell, a retired FBI agent, accurately diagnosed the underlying organizational mess much earlier in the timeline. Whenever things start falling apart, the rot almost always starts with the higher-ups. You rarely find the core problems lying with the everyday cops putting in the actual sweat equity. That gives you 3 distinct quotes from 3 separate insiders and affiliates of the department, completely aligned on the exact same narrative. It really makes you wonder what pushes lifelong cops, guys who've dedicated their whole adult lives to a police force, folks whose entire self-worth is tied to the badge, to publicly throw their boss under the bus right in the middle of an ongoing search for a missing victim. Nobody takes that leap lightly. They only speak out when keeping quiet starts doing way too much damage. Biting their tongues carried a heavy toll, and the ones suffering the consequences certainly weren't the executives sitting safely in their private offices. By the 24th day of the search, the entire dynamic changed thanks to something totally separate from the official police channels. There were no media briefings, no fancy microphones, and absolutely no sanitized PR spin cooked up by a police spokesperson. It was simply a lady in a yellow sweater, recording a solo 4-minute clip on her cell phone because she was completely fed up with the fake, sugar-coated hope everyone was selling. Taking to Instagram on February 24th, Savannah Guthrie used her quick video to achieve what nearly a month of police briefings couldn't. She finally laid out the brutal truth, saying she may already be gone. Those 5 words hit home in a way that nothing the sheriff ever mumbled at a presser could match. It wasn't because her message was overly theatrical, but simply because it was the truth, openly addressing the grim physical evidence that everyone had seen coming for weeks, while the authorities kept awkwardly dodging the subject. An 84-year-old woman, completely reliant on a pacemaker, had been missing for 24 straight days. That critical 24-hour deadline for her mandatory meds, which the sheriff himself brought up on day 2, was completely blown past, expiring more than 500 times. Savannah dropped the act entirely, sparking an instant reaction when her family offered up a $1 million bounty for any clues that could bring Nancy home. Barely 24 hours later, the hotline blew up with more than 1,600 solid leads, a figure the FBI later backed up. The 911 operators, who were previously swamped with 19,000 mostly unverified tips, were all of a sudden fielding totally different information. It was massive volume, but with actual direction. The phones rang not with random folks pitching wild theories, but with serious callers who were weighing genuine clues. A government representative explained to the network the exact purpose behind offering that specific bounty. Law enforcement isn't looking for 1,000 more tips. They are searching for just the right one. And that crucial lead isn't going to be phoned in by a random bystander glancing out their glass pane. That tip is going to originate from an individual who holds the actual truth, an individual harboring secrets they have kept hidden out of blind allegiance, pure terror, or simply waiting for the perfect moment to finally speak up. $1 million tends to completely shift a person's perspective in an absolute hurry. That very afternoon, her relatives revealed they were giving $500,000 to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. This specific fact is crucial since it reveals where her loved ones' heads were at. They were no longer viewing the situation as a straightforward search and recovery mission. These folks were focusing on the long-term mark she would leave behind, her broader influence, and the exact things Nancy would have desired no matter how the situation resolved, It represents an incredibly unique sort of mourning that operates quietly without drawing any attention to itself. Following the bounty reveal, the Phoenix branch of the FBI put out a press release urging locals to solely provide concrete, checkable, reality-grounded details. They strictly forbade sending emotional notes to the relatives, speculative ideas, or thoughts and prayers. The hotline was established for a single, distinct objective, according to them. That is definitely not your everyday, run-of-the-mill law enforcement phrasing. It clearly shows authorities attempting to narrow a massive deluge of useless data down into one clear channel, hunting for the solitary crucial clue hidden amidst a deafening roar of useless chatter. The network additionally noted Savannah's desire to put up the cash much sooner in the case. Police advised against it, worried that it would completely flood an already overworked phone bank. Yet the relatives went ahead and published it regardless. Just consider that choice for a second. Relatives forced to observe authorities working behind an opaque barrier they were completely shut out of, taking independent action using their personal funds since they realized that relying on slow police procedures just was not cutting it anymore. 4 minutes of absolute truth yielded vastly better, usable leads than 3.5 weeks of carefully curated public relations statements. Ponder what that implies regarding the details fed to citizens up to that point, as well as what folks were desperately holding out for. 25 days following the moment the local sheriff took the microphone to issue a statement meant to entirely close the book on the property search. They claimed the house was totally cleared and finished. Yet, an event occurred that completely contradicted those earlier claims, right in front of the broadcasting lenses. The motorcade showed up on February 25th, which marked day 25. At 9:15 in the morning, broadcasters from the news network had their recording gear set up right beyond Nancy Guthrie's Catalina Foothills estate as a pair of plain white cars rolled into the driveway. A single person walked in through the rear entrance, remained indoors for roughly 30 minutes, and departed without speaking a single word to the press crew. Then, right at 10:08 in the morning, the heavy hitters showed up. Several dark sport utility vehicles carrying over 6 people rolled in. A large portion of the group were dressed in formal business attire. The group navigated the grounds with the calculated precision of professionals who clearly understood precisely what they needed to find and the exact spots to search. A single car drove completely into the parking bay, shutting the overhead door immediately after entering. The news network called it the heaviest police turnout at that house in more than 7 days. Let that sink in, especially since the county's top cop had supposedly cleared that location on the very first day. A mere 20 hours following her vanishing, he glanced at his squad and pronounced the area completely processed. Fast forward 3.5 weeks, and government agents in dark cars were pulling into the very same house he had prematurely dismissed, well before detectives even named a single person of interest. A major shift had clearly occurred. A new detail dragged them back there. Yet the head of the department kept his mouth completely shut regarding the actual reason. On February 26th, an entirely distinct event introduced a fresh complication to the overall sequence of events. Fresh surveillance tape surfaced displaying a car driving quickly about 2.5 miles away from the victim's house, right at 2:30 in the morning on February 1st. That specific timestamp landed squarely within the critical 41-minute gap when the security feed cut out and the heart device went dead. Nobody knew who was inside, and detectives refused to openly state if the car had anything to do with the mystery. However, the clock proved it happened at the absolute most crucial moment. A car tearing through the Catalina Foothills neighborhood at 2:30 in the morning on the exact evening she was taken from her residence, a mere 2.5 miles from her property, perfectly matching the critical time frame, with absolutely no known driver. Assuming that car was genuinely involved, it gave the detectives a major breakthrough they had completely lacked up to that point. An actual physical path heading off from the property as the crime happened. A specific route, and quite possibly, based on whatever security cameras were set up down that road, a massive clue they could finally track down. Police showing back up at the house on day 25, combined with the fresh videotape dropping on day 26, perfectly coincided to imply the manhunt was entering a completely different stage. Folks were left wondering if this fresh chapter actually meant real progress or just another dead-end tip that would fizzle out into absolute nothingness. Authorities completely refused to clear anything up. The local top cop had effectively blacked out all details surrounding the manhunt from the very beginning. That barrier of silence stayed firmly in place on day 25. Absolutely nobody offered a single excuse for the massive motorcade. Officials never really touched on the car video during their media briefings. The same trio of guys who called all the shots starting on the 1st of February kept their tight grip on the reins. You have to wonder what is actually going on when cops wrap up a location on the very first day, only to have a fleet of federal cruisers swarm the exact same spot on day 25. Think about what shifted behind the scenes. Think about the clues they must have overlooked initially, forcing a bunch of agents in dark trucks to comb through that same carport nearly a month after the fact. The truth behind that shift is the core issue driving this entire search forward. In any criminal probe, there comes a tipping point where all those past choices crash together into a single, undeniable reality. That is when picking the wrong testing facility, locking out partner agencies, leaking details on live broadcast television, relying on a closed trio of leaders, and abandoning a key location cease to be isolated mistakes. Instead, they morph into an obvious, systematic routine of incompetence. We have officially reached that breaking point. That does not mean the mystery is solved, because it absolutely is not. However, we finally have enough facts out in the open to see exactly what was going down at the Pima County Sheriff's Office right from the get-go on February 1st, 2026, and it explains precisely why the search for a missing Nancy Guthrie played out the way it did. An 84-year-old lady was taken from her residence in just 41 minutes. The timeline to gather physical clues was incredibly narrow right from the start. DNA evidence that might have cracked the whole thing wide open was right there in a facility alongside the exact experts, the proper equipment, and the perfect workflow needed to analyze it quickly. Yet a single guy made the call to ship those samples 2,000 miles away to the wrong place. From then on, every single move, like who got to sit in on briefing, which items federal agents could handle, what details leaked to major networks, and what information the person of interest was fed, all originated from that exact same leader. According to Sergeant Aaron Cross, pretty much everyone in the precinct felt this whole thing had turned into a massive pride trip. Richard Kastigar Jr. openly stated that every piece of physical proof should have been shipped straight to the federal labs in Virginia right from day one. Richard Carmona noted that the rank and file were totally let down by the absolute failure of command coming from the top brass. Bob Krier, who used to run the tactical team, pointed out that the local cops desperately needed to hand over the reins to the feds, since the National Bureau brought way more firepower and funding to the table than a local precinct ever could. These are not just random haters pushing a narrative. These are actual deputies and insiders from the department going public, putting their own reputations on the line. When we put together this episode, Nancy Guthrie had been gone for over 37 days. Nobody has been slapped with cuffs. Law enforcement has not officially named a primary target. The Federal Bureau moved their main hub out of Tucson and up to Phoenix, though they are still keeping boots on the ground around the Catalina Mountains. The hotline is still taking calls. That $1 million bounty from her relatives is still on the table. And based on what the media is saying, the exact same guys who botched the initial search are somehow still calling the shots. Facing the music in a situation like this rarely happens overnight. Lines drawn between local and federal turf are set up by the law for very valid purposes. However, those red tape borders turn into a massive problem when a boss uses them to shield his own bruised ego from the disaster he is causing during an active manhunt. When shutting out the feds is less about following the law and more about settling an 11-year-old political beef. The top cop is not the one suffering the fallout. Nancy is the one paying the ultimate price. If you know anything at all about where she might be, please reach out straight to the Federal Bureau up in Phoenix or call the Pima County Sheriff's Department hotline directly. Her loved ones are still offering a $1 million bounty for answers. You can find the info linked right down below. Make sure you hit that subscribe button if you are new here. We refuse to deal in wild theories, and we never waste your time with fluff. We track the cold, hard facts, back up every single thing we say, and ride these mysteries out until the absolute truth comes to light. Nancy Guthrie is still out there somewhere, and this story is far from over. This narrative of Nancy Guthrie is more than a chilling mystery. It is a profound lesson on the high cost of human pride. Nancy wasn't just a case file. She was a mother, a grandmother, and a heartbeat that abruptly vanished into a 41-minute digital blackout. The tragedy in Tucson teaches us that in the race against time, ego is a lethal obstacle. When personal vendettas and decade-old grudges take precedence over specialized expertise, justice doesn't just slow down, it suffocates. True leadership is not defined by the absolute control of a narrative, but by the humility to accept help when a life is on the line. While the top brass hid behind sanitized PR spin, a daughter in a yellow sweater had the courage to speak the raw, brutal truth. Her vulnerability reminds us that transparency serves the victim, while secrecy only shields the incompetent. Let Nancy's story be a rallying cry. We must demand accountability over politics. We must value the lives of our most vulnerable over the bruised egos of the powerful. May we never let the noise of bureaucracy drown out the silence of the missing. Compassion must always trump pride, because every second of delay carries a price that no bounty can ever repay.